to and have argued against. We also have the collapse of state systems in Syria and Iraq. So the Middle East, which has never been simple and never been quiet, is even noisier and less simple. But we're lucky today to have Ambassador Ross with us. He has argued in the past that it's rarely been in the U.S.'s interest to create a separation between Israel and the United States, and these current events appear to be testing the bonds very seriously. And as I said, the recent Iran deal was signed in the face of Israeli opposition. We'll see what happens with Congress. And President Obama's broader policy towards Israel and certainly towards Syria and the Middle East as a whole has become very controversial. Just this past month, the Chicago Council Public Opinion Survey highlighted really big differences and partisan differences in how Israel is viewed by the American public. And really, it's a big matter on our agenda as to whether the two nations will be able to rekindle close ties, or is this relationship been altered in a more permanent way? We're fortunate to have Ambassador Ross with us today to take up these questions and explore their future implications. I told Ambassador Ross this would be a somewhat cursory introduction given his great distinction. He is a counselor and the William Davidson Distinguished Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Before his 2011 return to the Institute, he served as the Special Assistant to President Obama, Senior Director for the Central Region on the National Security Council, and Special Advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton. Ambassador Ross's experience in the Middle East already spans nearly 3 decades, involving work in both the public sector and academia. And he continues through extensive publications to inform us on the Middle East, arms control, the former Soviet Union, now Russia, and U.S.-Israel relations. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Ambassador Dennis Ross back to the Council.
Well, thank you. Obviously, this is a time where there's really nothing to say about the Middle East, but I'll struggle to do it anyway. You know, oftentimes when I go anyplace, I'm always asked, can I give people some good news? And I always say, well, do you want me to talk about the Middle East? And the answer is yes. Here, I could just start off by talking about the Cubs. So, you know, So I was actually tempted with this book not to call it Doomed to Succeed, but The Chicago Cubs and the Future of the U.S.-Israeli Relationship. But instead I came up with Doomed to Succeed, which obviously by definition implies that I'm an optimist about the relationship. This is a book that basically is about not just the relationship from Truman to Obama. I tell the story of each administration. I talk about what the present attitudes were, what the key assumptions were, was there unanimity or division within the administration on how to approach the Middle East. Israel was frequently derivative of how we saw the region. And, you know, in effect, I'm really trying to tell a story not just in Israel, but also the U.S. approach to the Middle East. I was tempted today in speaking not just to talk about the Cubs, but also there's been so much controversy over the division between the United States and Israel on Iran, and you mentioned it as well. I was tempted to talk a little bit about the Iran deal and then talk about the implications for the relationship as I outline it in the book. And I may yet do that because I'm fairly flexible as a speaker. But the more I think about it, particularly given the way you described the issues that you've been looking at here as a council, I'm a little bit more inclined to focus on some of the key assumptions that have driven us and driven constituencies in the national security apparatus about the relationship. So I think that's what I'm going to do. In fact, actually, I know that's what I'm going to do. And I'm going to start because I also teach. I teach at Georgetown, and One of the things I do with my students, I actually have one of my students who's also my assistant, was my former student. He knows that I often like to pose questions to the students. And I'm going to start with a question here. I'm going to frame it in the following fashion. In every administration, national security apparatus, there's been a constituency that basically looked at Israel as a liability, saw it as a problem for the United States. Constituency has existed in every administration. There's only one administration in which that constituency existed, but it had no weight, no real influence. So my question to you, can anybody guess which administration that was?
Nixon.
Sorry?
Nixon.
Obama, Nixon? The answer is Eisenhower. Remember what the question was? The question was, which administration did the constituency that viewed Israel as a problem have no weight? Now, I can tell you, on the contrary, in Truman, just the opposite. George W. Bush? Was that the guess? I mean, a lot of the guesses I can tell you so far, Nixon, absolutely not. Eisenhower, the exact opposite. Obviously, this suggests you all need to read the book. Here's what I anticipated that most of you would guess. It's definitely not this one either, because there is a very significant constituency that sees Israel as a problem, even though there's a countervailing one. The one I thought most of you would guess was George W. Bush. That's one I thought most would guess. And then my answer to you was going to be, good guess, but wrong. And I'll explain why it's wrong, and then I'll explain which administration it was. The reason it's wrong is that the first call that President Bush made to Ariel Sharon after 9/11, after the president has declared the war on terror, and at a time when there were bombs going off in Israel, was to push Ariel Sharon to have his then foreign minister, Shimon Peres, meet Yasser Arafat. Now, this is after the president has declared the war on terror. He certainly wouldn't have dreamed of having us talk to anybody who he saw as being responsible for bombings, but he was pushing the Prime Minister of Israel to have his foreign minister meet Yasser Arafat at a time when bombs were going off in Israel. And that was a function of attitudes in the State Department, and particularly in the intelligence community at that time, that said the reason 9/11 took place was because of our association with Israel and because of the Palestinians. Now, later on, President Bush evolves. He evolves because he says, wait a second, they're fighting terror, we're fighting terror. Can't have one set of rules for them, a different set of rules. And then he gives a speech on June 24th, 2002, in which he calls for a Palestinian state. For the first time, that becomes American policy, by the way. The Clinton parameters, of which I was the principal drafter, was a bridging proposal which would have provided for two states, but it was not our policy. It was a bridging proposal. He calls for two states, but he says it can't be a state that's based on terrorism and corruption. But he changes to get to that point. And so at 9/11, that's not where he is, and that constituency that I described had sufficient weight after 9/11 to get him to push the Prime Minister of Israel to do that. So that constituency I described not only existed at that point, it had a kind of predominant weight at that point. Over time, its weight diminishes. The only administration in which that constituency exists but has no weight is the Clinton administration. And the reason is that Bill Clinton basically views Israel through a lens. And the lens he sees it through is that the only real friend that Israel has is the United States. And even if we have disagreements with the Israelis, we should try to manage those disagreements in private. Doesn't mean, and I'll come back to this maybe later, doesn't mean he got along always with Bibi Netanyahu. He did not. But he preferred to manage the differences in private, not to push them in public. All right, so since I'm on a roll, I'm going to ask another question. Obviously, I enjoy asking questions. All right, so which administration do you think was the toughest on Israel throughout this whole period, from Truman to Obama? I'm just giving you reasons to read the book. That's all I'm doing. Which one do you think was the toughest? Eisenhower probably is the toughest in one respect, but there's another one I have in mind. I'll explain in a minute why I have it in mind. But Eisenhower was the toughest because what Eisenhower does is Eisenhower threatens sanctions at Israel. Eisenhower, during the 1956 war, actually contemplates using American forces to expel Israeli forces from the Sinai. He threatens sanctions. His Undersecretary of State, Herbert Hoover Jr., and he's the one who conveys this message because John Foster Dulles suffered a severe abdominal attack, which turned out to be cancer. So he's in the hospital during the Suez War, and so Herbert Hoover, the Undersecretary of State, is the one who conveys this message, and among other things, he threatens Israel with expulsion from the UN. But that's not the administration that I wanted to single out. There's another administration that actually imposes penalties that no other administration does impose. No? Good guess, but did someone say Reagan? Yes. Now, Reagan isn't remembered that way. Ronald Reagan is the only president who suspends shipments of arms deliveries to Israel as a punishment. He's the only one who does it. He suspends as a result of Israel bombing the Osirak reactor in Iraq, F-16s, and then when Menachem Begin surprises him in December of 1981 and extends Israeli law and administration to the Golan Heights, he suspends it again, F-16s. He also, the real low point in relations between the United States and Israel is actually during the siege of Beirut in the summer of 1982, and then in the aftermath when the PLO withdraws from Beirut, when you have Sabra and Shatila. And that is really the low point in the relations. Now I'm going to come back to Reagan because Reagan is on the one hand the low point in the relationship, and in many ways he's the administration that transforms the relationship in a fundamental way. The first administration to provide arms to Israel is the Kennedy administration. Under Truman and under Eisenhower, we don't provide arms. There is such a sense that Israel is such a liability and what's going to cost us with the Arabs that we don't provide arms. Kennedy breaks the taboo, easy for me to say, the taboo on providing arms. An administration that is the one that is transformative in terms of treating Israel for the first time as a strategic partner. It comes after the first 2 years. What I was describing in terms of the low points and in terms of the harshness of the relationship comes in 1981 and 1982, begins to change in 1983, primarily because Secretary of State George Shultz negotiates something called the May 17th Agreement, in which the Israelis agree that they will withdraw from Lebanon provided that Syria does. His envoy at the time has been Philip Habib. Habib has told him, starting back in September of '82, that he has a commitment from the Saudis that they will get the Syrians provided the Israelis do. Between September of 1982 and May of 1983, the balance of power changes because the Soviets replenish not only everything that the Syrians have lost in the conflict, they bring in SAM-5s. They actually have some doesn't it? It has Soviets beginning to man the SAM-5s, which is a longer-range surface-to-air missile, air defense missile. Hezbollah is on the ground, is created. They're able to use Hezbollah and militias to go after the Israelis, and suddenly Assad no longer feels he has to withdraw. And in the aftermath of that, the aftermath of what Reagan and Shultz see as the buildup of the Soviet presence there and the Syrian intransigence, Reagan goes back to his roots. Reagan's emotional instincts from the very beginning are to be very pro-Israeli. It's driven by the fact that he, in World War II, he was responsible for doing training films, and he saw the initial films of the liberation of the death camps. And he tells George Shultz later on, he saves those films because he's so horrible he doesn't believe people actually believe what happened. And he feels he has a moral obligation to Israel because of it. But in the first 2 years, there's a kind of constant surprising by the Israelis. The bombing of Osirak, which Reagan later thinks maybe wasn't such a bad idea, but at the time he thought it wasn't so great. what goes on in Beirut and so forth. Because of the frustration of the May 17 Accord, and because of what the Soviets are doing, and because of the way he sees the Syrians, he goes back to his roots and his instincts, and he promotes something called strategic cooperation. November 1983, don't worry, there's not going to be a quiz just because I know all these dates. It's only because I spent a lot of time writing the book. November 29, 1983, they sign, Shamir is then the prime minister. He signs an agreement with us to establish strategic cooperation and something called the Joint Political Military Group. This becomes the umbrella group for the first time creating institutional cooperation on security, military to military cooperation, intelligence, counterterror cooperation. Until this time, there is no structure for cooperation. Now there's an architecture for cooperation, and every president who comes after Reagan, even if that president doesn't share the same instincts towards Israel, builds on the structure of that relationship. For the first time, Israel is viewed as being a country that not only shares our values, but shares our interests and is seen as an asset when it comes to dealing with the threats we face. That is the turning point that comes, and transformation that comes with Ronald Reagan. Now, there's something else that is emblematic of the change in Reagan. Reagan is the first administration where there is a countervailing constituency to the one I was describing before. I said there was a constituency in every administration from Truman to Obama that saw Israel through the lens of competition, being a liability, being a problem. In the Reagan administration, for the first time, there's a counter-constituency that emerges of experts who then become embedded in the bureaucracy over time, who believe that actually Israel is not just a country that shares values, but it's a friend, it's a partner, and the more we work with Israel, A, it's better for us, B, the more we work with Israel, Israel will be more responsive to us. Some of this is driven by the sense of how you promote peace, make it more likely. Some of it is driven by a sense that Israel is a natural partner. From that time on, you have a counter-constituency, and there are debates within administrations. The weight between these two constituencies varies from administration to administration. I would suggest to you, when you read the Obama chapter, which you all will, you'll find that in the first term, the balance between those two constituencies after the first year is tilted more towards those who see Israel more in what I've described as the favorability, friend-partner camp. In the second term, it has reverted more to the weight of those who see it more as a problem. All right, so when I talk about these two constituencies, what are the key assumptions that have driven and been a part of that constituency that sees Israel as a problem, and these assumptions have been embedded from Truman's time on? Now, this is a question I'm not posing to you. This is a question I'm posing that I'm going to answer for you, okay? I often say, you can count on one thing. Whenever I pose a question, you can count on the fact that I can answer it, all right? All right, so on this issue, there basically have been three interrelated assumptions that were embodied in this constituency. The first assumption, I said they're interrelated. The first assumption is that if we want to gain with the Arabs, we need to distance ourselves from Israel. The second assumption is a corollary, that if we cooperate with Israel, it's going to cost us with the Arabs. And the third is that the key to improving America's position in the Middle East is resolving the Israeli-Arab or Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, I want to take you through these assumptions because they have been deeply embedded in at least one of the constituencies that has been in every administration, and at least the first two have been repeatedly demonstrated to be invalid. And I want to highlight for you some examples of that. All right, remember, I said the first assumption was if we distance ourselves from the Israelis, we would gain with the Arabs. So, some of this, by the way, it's if you want to, the book starts with Truman, but actually I do a little bit of Roosevelt because I had to describe what was the legacy that Truman inherited. William Eddy, who was the translator in the meeting that Roosevelt has with Ibn Saud in the Great Bitter Lakes, he writes a memo in advance in preparing for this meeting where he basically describes what Sal's attitudes are towards the Jews, and he quotes him saying that the Jews are cursed in history to the end of time. And the implication is, you better not do anything with Ibn Sa'd that implies that you could be supportive of what's happening in Palestine, all right? That attitude becomes sort of deeply embedded over time and helps to explain why there is this sense that somehow, if we distance ourselves from the Israelis, we will benefit. I want to give you just a couple of examples, just to start with. I already mentioned what went on in the Eisenhower administration. There was no administration that made more of an effort to distance itself from Israel than the Eisenhower administration. And there's probably no administration that did more badly with the Arabs than the Eisenhower administration. Now, you can talk about all sorts of reasons, but this is just a fact. When Dulles takes his first trip to the region, which is in May of 1953, he takes a 3-week trip. And he goes out of his way to show we're going to be different than Truman. And the image that he wants to portray is Truman was too close to the Jews. I mean, he literally says this sort of thing. And he has a meeting in Lebanon where he says, we're going to be different. We will act against Israeli aggression. This is one of the things he says. We will act against Israeli aggression. Now, I might suggest to you at that time, Israel in 1953 is not a very large state. You know, there are no territories, that are occupied, right? This isn't post-67. There isn't the West Bank. There isn't the Sinai. There isn't the Golan Heights. We will act against Israeli aggression, is what he says. He is trying to prove how different he will be. To be fair to him, he tells Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion says to him when he comes to Israel, Ben-Gurion says, look, what the Arabs need is money. They don't need arms. You shouldn't be going around offering arms. If you give them arms, it'll be used against us. Don't think it's going to be used against the Soviets in supporting you. And Dulles kind of blows him off. But Dulles tells him. He basically tells him everything he's been saying everywhere he's been going in the region. So at least he's honest about it. But there's a kind of constant pattern of distancing. The Israelis, at one point early in 1953, are trying to develop the Jordan River for irrigation purposes. We suspend loans to them because this is something that the Arabs don't like and are complaining about. And this is a pattern in the Eisenhower administration. They reject anything that looks like we may be drawing closer to the Israelis. I'll give you another example. As I said, didn't do very well. I'm going to give you a more concrete example now. The Nixon administration, President Nixon, in the spring of 1970, suspends shipments of Phantom aircraft to Israel. It's definitely not for me. Although I'm willing to answer it, it's okay. All right, so in the spring of 1970, Richard Nixon suspends Phantom aircraft to Israel. Now, I said before, the only one who suspended aircraft deliveries or military deliveries as a punishment was Reagan. Richard Nixon is not suspending this as a punishment. He suspends it because he's trying to reach out to Nasser and the Egyptians. Now, I want to put this in context. To put it in context, we suspend these shipments of Phantom Force to Israel at the very moment the Soviet Union, for the first time, is exporting its personnel, military personnel, outside of the Soviet bloc. They're sending their military personnel to Egypt. It comes out about 10,000 military people they put on the ground at this time because they're building a wider air defense network. They're going to man the SAM-2s and the SAM-3s. There's a war of attrition going on between Egypt and Israel at this time, and there's some deep penetration raids by the Israelis, and Nasser requests this. They do it for the first time. Nasser requests at the end of December. He goes to Moscow in January, and we suspend in March Phantoms to Israel at a time when the Soviets are putting not just weapon systems, but for the first time are sending their military outside of the Eastern Bloc. If you think that President Obama is being passive right now, in the face of what Putin is doing in Syria, that pales in comparison to what was done at this particular moment. And why was he doing it? To reach out to the Egyptians. He sent his Undersecretary of State Cisco to see Nasser right after this, hoping that this will actually produce a payoff. And guess what Nasser does? To use a diplomatic term, he blows him off and simply rejects it. The pattern, I could cite more examples, but you have to read the book to see them. I can cite more examples of this, but every time we engage in this kind of distancing, we don't gain. Instead, what we see from the Arabs are increasing expectations and more demands. All right, so let me deal with the corollary that I mentioned, the second assumption. Because I'm going to bring this one, I'm going to bring it up to date. But I'm going to start with a historical example to begin with. All right, remember the second assumption was that you have to, if we cooperate with Israel, we will pay a price. This is a corollary to the first. We distance, we'll gain with the Arabs. This one says if we do anything with Israel, we pay a price. So President Kennedy, as I said, is the first one to provide arms to Israel. He provides the Hawk anti-aircraft missile. It's a defensive system only. It causes a big debate within his administration. The Secretary of State says that this will set a terrible precedent and will cause us great damage with the Arabs. If I were to cite for you some of what was being said from our ambassadors in Arab states at the time about the sale, it would make what I just described about Russ seem completely timid by comparison about what they were predicting were going to be the consequences if we did this. So the day that this sale becomes public happens to be the day that Dean Russ, Secretary of State, is meeting with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia in New York at the opening of the UN General Assembly. And that's Crown Prince Faisal, who at that time, as Rachel would know, was actually the putative leader in Saudi Arabia. He's going to replace King Saud in the not-too-distant future. And does he address the arms sale, which has gone public that day? No. What does he raise? He raises the coup in Yemen, because the coup in Yemen is backed by the Egyptian and is seen as a threat to Saudi Arabia. That's not, his preoccupation isn't the fact that we just sold arms to the Israelis and that's been publicly revealed. It's the coup in Yemen because that's the threat. 1 week later, he sees President Kennedy. And he says to him, your economic assistance to Nasser, because the Kennedy administration tries to have a balanced relationship with both sides. It breaks the taboo on arms to Israel, but also the Kennedy administration reaches out to Nasser. And by this time, we're providing about 2/3 of the Egyptian bread supply. And the whole idea is that we can affect Nasser's behavior. And the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia says to him, you're reaching out to Nasser, you're providing this kind of assistance, you are fueling their aggression in the region. What you're doing, your outreach to Egypt, is destabilizing the region. He's not concerned about the arms to Israel. He's concerned about what we're doing with Egypt and how it's going to come at Saudi Arabia's expense. Now, does that sound familiar to you? Fast forward to today. Why don't you substitute the word Iran for Egypt? What are we hearing now from the Saudis? Our outreach to Iran is destabilizing, is a threat to the region, is a threat to Saudi Arabia. What does it tell us about this notion of, in a sense, you cooperate with Israel, you pay a price? What does it tell us about what the real priorities in the region are? The real priorities for Arab leaders over time has always been their security, their survival. It is the intra-regional competition that they see as a threat to them. Now, I'm not suggesting that they don't sometimes, I'll even say more than that, I'm not suggesting they may not be concerned about the Israelis, but they never make their relationship with us dependent on our relationship with Israel, because that's not what is the key to their security. The key to their security is knowing that we will be there when they need us. They will not make their security or survival, which they see as being tied to their relationship with us, dependent on what we do with the Israelis, and they never have. The issue of our reliability is what matters. There's another interesting parallel. I wasn't going to raise it, but since I'm on a roll, and I think I still have time, yeah? Okay. I do know I have spoken here before, and I know that if I exceed my time, what you don't know is there's actually a trap door here. So I know to stay within the bounds of my time. So in the fall of 1969, when Gaddafi came to power in Libya, Kissinger writes about how every single one of America's friends in the region at the leader level was communicating to us, do we not care about what's happening in the region? The region is going the way of these radical nationalists, and our friends are suffering, and we're being passive in the face of it. We're being indifferent in the face of it, and the whole regional balance of power is changing. And then, by the way, when we're passive in the face of, a few months later, of the Soviets going into Egypt, what begins to change things for us is in September of 1970, and during what's known as Black September, we actually use the Israelis at a time when the Syrians go into Jordan as a way of ending that crisis. We move forces around, and it looks finally like one of our friends wins and one of the Soviet friends loses. The issue of reliability is what matters in the eyes of these Arab leaders in the past and today. We can debate what's the best way to be reliable, but we shouldn't kid ourselves about what tends to drive them. And in a sense, it isn't Israel. It isn't to say, in the Palestinian issue, I said the third assumption was, all right, we will never really be well in the region unless we solve this conflict. And I would simply say to you today that if tomorrow we could solve the conflict, and we're not going to be able to solve it tomorrow because we may not have an intifada there right now because it isn't organized, but we have a low level of violence every day that looks ad hoc. And we can come back in the Q&A about what I would do to try to deal with this issue. But if tomorrow there was divine intervention to solve this conflict, it wouldn't stop one barrel bomb in Syria. It wouldn't change what's going on in Egypt. It wouldn't stop the war in Yemen. It wouldn't change what's happening in Iraq. This is a region now that's characterized by a profound set of troubles. And it actually helps me put in perspective, the U.S.-Israeli relationship even today. Again, the title of the book is Doomed to Succeed. It's not Doomed to Succeed, question mark. So why do I draw that conclusion? Why do I note that there's been an evolution in the relationship over time and that there's a basic trajectory to that relationship? Well, we've seen that Israel and the United States share values and share interests. There is a convergence from that standpoint. There's also a perception of shared threat. Those who threaten us tend to threaten the Israelis and vice versa. When you look at the region today and you look to the future, and this is relevant to the issues you were raising in your introduction, this is a region that's going to be characterized by a fundamental struggle of the worst kind. Because the struggle that's going on right now in the region is over identity, who defines it, who controls it. You have a breakdown, as you said, of the state system. You have conflicts that are now reduced to tribe, clan, and sect. You have proxy wars that are going on, but it's about not just the balance of power, it's about who's going to define that identity. And the nature of these conflicts are not going to go away anytime soon. My own guess is we're looking at least the next decade and maybe longer. Now, in that picture that I just painted, there's one state that actually has a set of institutions. One state that has a rule of law, a separation of powers, an independent judiciary. One state where you have regularly and unregularly scheduled elections. One state where the loser in those elections accepts the outcome. One state where there's freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. One state where there's a respect for women's rights and gay rights, and that's Israel. And its orientation towards us isn't going to change. So in the midst of all this turmoil, the relationship's not going to unravel. Because the only state, in a sense, that has the potential to deal with its problems, and Israel has real problems, but it has the institutions to cope with them. And it has a kind of resiliency. Now, it isn't to say, I'll wrap up in 1 second. I'm stepping off the trap door, but I'll wrap up in 1 second. It isn't to say that there aren't some alarm bells, and that those who care about the relationship shouldn't be paying attention to those alarm bells. And I go into this in the concluding chapter. But some of the alarm bells are, if this relationship is going to remain on the path that it has been on, Israel cannot be a partisan issue. Israel cannot be a Republican issue or a Democratic issue. It has to remain an American issue. And these signs that there's a move towards trying to make this a partisan issue, anybody who tries to make it a partisan issue is actually not a friend of Israel. And they don't understand the roots of the relationship. Secondly, it is very important for Israel to retain its character and its values as an unmistakable democracy. Efforts to try to change who Israel is should be seen and approached with some concern and alarm as well. It's precisely because you go to different parts of this country where, in fact, there's no Jewish community, and there's an instinctive support for Israel because of what it represents in comparison to everyone else, but in terms of who it is. Making sure Israel doesn't become a partisan issue, making sure Israel retains its values and its identity as it is, becomes even more important when you look at this country. In 25 to 30 years, we will be a minority-majority country. The Asian American community, the Hispanic American community, the African American community doesn't have the same historic connections to Israel. And that needs to be nurtured on the one hand, but it also needs to be, from my standpoint, it's very important to be mindful about presenting Israel for who it is and ensuring those values are maintained. It's one of the reasons also I would like to see Israel take initiatives on peace, even though this is a very difficult time. You know, there's a delegitimization movement out there. There's a BDS movement. Nobody knows that BDS is against the international consensus on two states because BDS is able to focus on Israeli activities, especially settlement activities. I would love to see Israel take an initiative where they make it clear that their settlement policy is consistent with their two-state policy, meaning that what they do in settlements, I would like to see them not build outside the blocks. And say, even if the Palestinians aren't going to respond to this, do it because what it shows is Israel is acting to ensure that a two-state outcome is possible. It allows you to begin to focus on the BDS, which does not want two states, which rejects two states. That would also be in keeping with highlighting Israel and who it is and its values. In the end, I remain an optimist. Of course, look, I spent the last 30 years working on the idea of peace, so I must be an optimist. But, you know, most optimism is also rooted in something. And I would say mine is ultimately rooted in reality. And I think this relationship is also rooted in reality. Thank you very much.
He really is afraid of a trapdoor. Thanks very much, Ambassador Ross. Now we'd like to go out to the audience for questions. If you could raise your arms, wait for the mic, and make sure that your question is brief, that would be great. We'll start right here with Joan Porat at the head table, please. 1 second, Joan, we need a mic.
To jump right into the Iran question, which you just touched on. If Netanyahu next week comes in and asks the Americans to provide mountain busters, do you think it would be likely that the Congress, both nonpartisan, would agree to that, or that Obama would, separating that from the bunker busters?
Yeah. Obviously, you've read other things I've written, because there
yes.
are very few people who refer to this as mountain busters. We have provided the Israelis bunker busters, and the President, in his letter to Congressman Nadler, trying to address some of the concerns that Congressman Nadler raised during the debate on the Iran nuclear deal, offered what were new bunker busters. I have raised the issue of how do you enhance deterrence. My own position on the Iran deal was that, A, it bought for real 15 years. Anybody who says it doesn't, they're not reading the agreement. B, I didn't see an alternative that could be negotiated, because of the 5+1, no one else was coming back to the table, and we were going to make ourselves the problem, not the Iranians. But I genuinely worried about what happens after year 15, because there are no limitations on how big the infrastructure is that the Iranians can build after year 15. There still is monitoring of their program, but even the monitoring becomes a little harder if the program becomes dramatically bigger. And so I don't want the Iranians to think that after year 15, when the gap between threshold status and weapons status will be very small, I don't want them to be tempted to think, you know what, we can move quickly at a certain point and present the world with a fait accompli. So I wanted to build a firewall that today, that the Iranians will understand, there's a firewall there between where you're going to be and going for weapons. And I want them to know that if they move towards weapons, that would trigger force, not sanctions. So I wanted a declaratory policy to be blunt like that. I wanted us to make it clear that they can't produce highly enriched uranium, because after year 15, they actually can't. Nothing prevents them from doing it. For 15 years they can't, but after year 15, nothing prevents them from doing that. And I raised the issue as a way of making our words credible, meaning there might be some who question whether we will act, even if we say so. There's very few who question whether the Israelis would if they saw the Iranians dashing towards a weapon. And so I said there's one of the enrichment sites at Fordo is built into a mountain. Bunker busters are ineffective against that. The massive ordnance penetrator, which is a 30,000-pound bomb, which has a fuse that ignites only after it penetrates deep underground, I wanted us to be prepared to make a commitment that somewhere before the end of the 15-year period, we would transfer that to Israel, and we would transfer as well the means to be able to use it. At this point, there is legislation that is now working on the Hill that is not, at least the legislation that currently exists is kind of euphemistic when it relates to that. It doesn't relate to it explicitly. And the administration at this point has been able to restrain its enthusiasm for this proposal. But I think if, I don't know if Prime Minister Netanyahu will raise it when he comes and meets the President on November 9th. I hope he does. I think, again, this is not something the President has to provide. He makes a commitment that it would be done before year 15. And I think it would underpin the deterrence. I think it would make it more credible. It would be good if it's done by President Obama, because the rest of the world is much more likely to embrace this as something that is legitimate, and that, in fact, if the Iranians make a move towards that, which is in violation of what they commit to in the agreement. They say in the agreement they will not pursue, develop, or acquire nuclear weapons. So the reason for doing this is if they do, the world knows this is what the response should be. And the world knows it and accepts it. And that makes it less likely that the Iranians would do it. So I would hope to see that done, and we'll have to see if it's done or not.
Next question, please. Yes, the gentleman over here, please. The mic's just coming. We're live stream, so we need to be on the mic.
What do you think of Netanyahu? Very short question.
Wow.
With regard to what?
Well, regardless, he's capable of, you said there should be a peace initiative by the current administration. Is he capable of doing that?
Is he capable of doing what I suggested? I think it would be very hard with the makeup of his current government. But if you had a national unity government, I think it would be very likely. If you actually look at where Israel is building, for the most part, they're not building outside the blocks, but they don't admit that. They don't acknowledge that. So they don't get any credit for having a position that actually is consistent with a two-state outcome. To be fair, there still is a small amount of building that is going on beyond the blocks. I want this to be a declaratory policy, so in fact it's clear. There's a conscious decision. We're adopting a position whose purpose is to make it unmistakable. We accept a two-state outcome. A one-state outcome is a mistake. We're against it. And that, I think, needs to be declaratory policy. Given, he has a one-vote majority. And within the Jewish Home Party would absolutely reject this, and they might leave the government over it. So he wouldn't have a government if he did it. If the Zionist Union, which is really the Labor Party, if it were to come in, then I think you could do this. I think it's necessary for it to be done for the reasons I said. It's not, I don't say do it because you're going to get a Palestinian response right now. You're not going to get a Palestinian response right now. But if you really want to affect the Palestinians, the one thing that has moved the Palestinians over time is their own sense of achievement. What's that achievement? That achievement is that their cause on the international stage not only has sympathy but support. If you have an Israeli government that makes an initiative, shows it's prepared to do something, and there's no responsiveness from the Palestinians, that's the one way you could begin to affect the Palestinian calculus. Because they could see themselves losing the one achievement they have, the kind of fundamental sympathy on the world stage.
Thanks. Next question over here, Andy Zamanides, please.
Thanks. Your analysis about every time we try to distance ourselves from Israel, we get no points with the Arab regimes. Now where there's a perceived distance with Israel, is it making it even worse with the Arab regimes? Are we losing credibility in the region because it seems that the one solid ally that we have, we've kind of frayed relationships there?
I think it's one of the factors that has contributed to the perception of the administration right now. Fairly or not, the perception among our traditional friends in the region right now is that the U.S. is not reliable. You know, I can tell you for sure, because when I go out there, you know, sometimes if I put a blindfold on, I don't know who I'm talking to. If I'm in Israel, or if I'm in Jordan, or if I go to Saudi Arabia, if I go to the other Gulf states, when it comes to how we're perceived right now, it's all the same. And there's a lot of factors that have contributed to that. The red line in Syria that wasn't acted on, the perception about, you know, certainly the Gulf states about it, throwing Mubarak under the bus, the passivity now, passivity in response to what the Russians are doing adds a lot to this. But I also think, you know, differences with the Israelis don't reassure them. Because oftentimes, I've actually had someone say to me out there, my God, if they're prepared to do this to the Israelis, imagine what they do to us. So I do think that there is a kind of perceptual gap between where the administration is and where those in the region are. Again, the issue of reliability. And as I said, look, what I'm suggesting doesn't mean to say you have to do whatever they want. I'm not suggesting that. But also something else I hear in the region all the time is the Russians come to us and say, you may not like what we're doing, but you can see we stand by our friends. Compare that to the Americans. And we'll have to contend with that in this region. But that is a problem right now.
Rachel Bronson, please.
Thank you. Dennis, right at the end you said that anyone who makes Israel a partisan issue is no friend of Israel. What do you make of the argument that Netanyahu and the way that President Obama were selling the Iran deal, those two are being quite partisan in their approaches to Americans?
Well, there's no doubt, I think, that there's no doubt that if you look at what happened in the vote, I think Brad would know this even better than me, but I certainly saw, because I spent a lot of time on the Hill, because I was asked to go up by most members to talk about how I saw the Iran deal. A lot of the Democrats had questions about the deal, but were really, they didn't see an alternative, and they were really put off by what they saw as a direct partisan appeal to the Republicans. There was clearly a reaction to that, for sure. And I think if you look at the president's speech at American U, you know, when he sort of equated the Republican caucus to the Revolutionary Guard in Iran, at the time I was actually told by Republican senators who were looking for a way to come in, and then some of those conversations took place the day before, and I can tell you, they suddenly lost their interest after that. So, you know, two. And I think in this case, it took both sides. But I think it's a lesson for us and for the Israelis. You got to stop that. It will not be good for us and this relationship. And I actually think, from a policy standpoint, more generally, it's not good. So yes, I think it was quite troubling. I heard it a lot when I was on the Hill. I will say this: many of the people that I spoke to on the Hill especially on the Democratic side, because they were the ones wrestling with it much more than on the Republican side. There is no single issue on which I've ever gone on something as complicated as this agreement, a 159-page agreement, a complicated arms control agreement. When I would go up there and speak to members, I was always struck by how thoroughly they had studied it. And I can't say historically that I've had many previous examples where I saw anything quite like that. It was part and parcel of a genuine grappling with the issue. On the one hand, it was kind of inspiring, and it was reassuring. So in this context of great partisanship, which was unsettling, I also saw people taking their responsibilities very seriously, and that I choose to sort of, since I like to see the glass half full, I'm going to focus on that side of it.
Thanks. Next question from the Israeli Consul General in Chicago, Rui Gilad.
Ambassador Ross, one of the things that Prime Minister Netanyahu is adamant about when renewing the negotiations is for the Palestinians to recognize that we'll end up with two nation states, that Palestinians will recognize that Israel will be a Jewish state. And the Palestinians are systematic in refusing it, using all kinds of arguments. How significant you think is this?
How what?
Significant. Does it really reflect something which is bigger, suggesting that maybe they do not consider the conflict to be only about territory or about something else? You might have read the article that was published in Haaretz by Shlomo Avineri that suggesting that maybe to the Palestinian, the conflict is about something which is much bigger than only territory.
You know, one of my, and this has been kind of a siren song of mine for at least the last 3 years, what has worried me for at least the last 3 years is what I see as a fundamental disbelief on both sides about the purposes of the other. Within Israel, within the mainstream, there's no question that the unwillingness is not so much to treat Israel as a Jewish state, because it's really, Israel is the state of the Jewish people with full civil rights for minorities, but the unwillingness to accept that basically raises the kind of questions that Shlomo Avineri raised. And Shlomo Avineri is not, for anybody who knows him, you know, is probably one of the most impressive academics in Israel for a long time, was the Director General of the Foreign Ministry under Rabin, a very serious guy. And he's certainly not someone, if anything, I would describe him as being on center-left within Israel. And what he's raising is the Palestinian rejection of the concept of two states for two peoples raises questions about whether they will actually really reconcile themselves with Israel as a state for the Jewish people. And, you know, I think as the conflict sort of feeds on itself and as disbelief becomes greater and greater, part of the problem on the Palestinian side is they look at grievance and victimhood as making it impossible to even think about ever accommodating in any way, shape, or form. Today, the very concept of compromise with Israel is seen as illegitimate among Palestinians. This is, in some ways, it's unsettling on the Israeli side, and I understand why it's unsettling on the Israeli side. But I think it's symptomatic of what is that deeper problem. I mean, Palestinians will always say to me, if the Israelis really accept an independent state, how come they build in what would be ours? And I never have a good answer for that. And it's part of what I say is the kind of mutuality of disbelief. We're not in a position where you can make peace today. One of the problems that we face generally in diplomacy, whether it's on this issue or even how we're approaching the Syrian question today, if you create your choice as always being a binary choice, we're going to solve the problem or we're going to do nothing. We have to go do boots on the ground or we do nothing. Well, when you create the choice that way, whether it's on peace or it's on Syria, what it means is we'll do nothing. And in this region, we see whenever you do nothing, there's a vacuum, and the vacuum is always filled by the worst possible forces. It would be great if the vacuum would be filled by more moderate, reasonable forces. It never is. I mean, one of the other lessons from history, and this book is about the past and also a prescription for the future, one of the things you see is that vacuums are always filled by the worst possible forces. And a lesson for our own policy is not to reduce our choices to those two extremes, but to think about, all right, the essence of Good Statecraft, which is another book I wrote, is that you marry objectives and means. And if you can't achieve certain objectives at this stage, then focus on what do I have to do to change the circumstances so at some point what I can't achieve now can be achieved over time. And that needs to inform our approach to the region, and certainly needs to inform our approach on the peace issue.
Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, that's all we have time for, but Ambassador Ross will be signing his book over there. Please join me in thanking him for coming back to Chicago Council. Thank you so much. Really good. Thanks, and good luck with the rest of your trip.
Thank you.